I was 8 years old when my parents told me I had to leave. They sat me down at the dining table, their faces unreadable. My mom folded her hands together, like she was trying to keep them from shaking. My dad just stared at a spot on the wall behind me. Then my mom finally spoke. "You're gonna stay with Aunt Rachel and Uncle Tom for a little while," she said. For a second, I thought she was joking. We'd visited my aunt and uncle a few times before, but they lived in another state, 6 hours away. It didn't make sense. I asked why. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made me feel better. "It's just for a little bit," she said. "It'll be like an adventure." That was the first sign something was wrong. How carefully they chose their words, like they were trying to make it sound exciting, not scary. I asked if Lily was coming too. My little sister was only 6. If we were going on an adventure, she should be coming with me. My mom hesitated, then shook her head. "No, sweetie, Lily's going to stay here." That's when my stomach dropped. I don't remember if I cried or argued. I just remember the feeling of panic when my dad stood up and said, "You should go pack." Not a request. A statement, a decision that had already been made. I ran to my room expecting them to stop me, to say they changed their minds. They didn't, they only gave me a few hours. I shoved clothes into a suitcase, not even knowing what I should take. My mom peeked in once, told me to bring my favorite stuffed animal, like that was supposed to make it better. That night, my dad drove me to my aunt and uncle's house. My mom didn't come. She hugged me at the door, kissed my forehead, and said, "Be good." Then she shut the door. We didn't talk much on the drive. I kept waiting for my dad to explain, but all he said was, "This is what's best for the family." I kept asking when I'd come home. He wouldn't answer. By the time we got to my aunt's house, it was past midnight. My aunt and uncle looked surprised to see me, like they hadn't expected me to actually show up. My dad barely stayed 10 minutes. He told my aunt he had work in the morning, then patted my head, told me to be good again, and left. I watched from the window as his car disappeared down the street. I kept waiting for the taillights to turn around. They never did. The first few weeks at my aunt and uncle's were weird. They weren't mean, but they weren't warm either. More like distant babysitters than family. Their house was neat, quiet, too clean. My cousins, who were teenagers, barely spoke to me. I got the feeling they didn't want me there. I overheard my older cousin muttering something about another mouth to feed. My parents called once a week. The conversations were short. "Are you behaving? Are you eating well?" They never asked how I felt. If I said I missed home, they changed the subject. At school, kids asked why I wasn't living with my real parents. I didn't know what to say. I made up stories, something about my parents traveling, something about them being too busy with work. But I didn't believe it, and neither did they. Lily sent me letters, but they were infrequent. Just a few sentences, written in large, uneven letters with little doodles. "I miss you," she wrote, but something felt off. My parents never included messages of their own, and I started wondering if they had even wanted her writing to me at all. I started noticing other things too. When I checked my parents' Facebook, they posted pictures, family outings, birthday parties, holidays, but I wasn't in any of them. It was like I never existed. I wrote letters to them, asking why they sent me away. They never wrote back. One night, I woke up thirsty and went to get water. I heard my aunt and uncle whispering in the kitchen. "We can't keep lying to him." My aunt said. My uncle sighed. "It's not our place." I didn't know what they were talking about, but I knew one thing. There was a secret, and it had something to do with me. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I didn't belong. My parents weren't bringing me back. They weren't even thinking about me. I had no idea why they did it, but I promised myself one thing. One day, I would find out. It had been nearly a year since I was sent away. By then, I had stopped expecting answers. My parents called less often, their voices more distant with each passing week. My aunt and uncle never spoke about when I would go home. The idea of temporary had quietly turned into something permanent. Then one afternoon, my aunt handed me a package. She hesitated before giving it to me, her lips pressed tight like she was holding something back. She said it had arrived months ago but had been put in storage and forgotten. The box was plain, taped sloppily at the edges. My name was scribbled on top in my dad's handwriting. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were old family photos, some loose, some in albums. At first it seemed normal. Pictures from birthdays, vacations, random moments at home. But as I flipped through them, something felt wrong. I was barely in any of them. In some, I was cropped out. In others, I was in the farthest corner, like an afterthought. The few that did have me in them felt staged. A stiff smile here, a hand resting on my shoulder there. At the bottom of the box, I found a folded piece of paper. It was a single note from my dad. "One day, you'll understand." That was it. No explanation, no apology, just those 5 words. I carried the note straight to my aunt and uncle, demanding answers. They exchanged glances. My aunt shook her head, muttering about how it wasn't their place. My uncle sighed, rubbing his forehead. Then, without thinking, he let something slip. It was supposed to be temporary. The room went silent. I pressed harder. What did he mean by supposed to be? Did my parents change their minds? Why? My aunt shot him a warning look before saying they didn't know the full story. But the way she said it, the way her voice wavered, told me she knew more than she was letting on. That night, I called Lily. Her voice was different. distant, careful. She used to ramble excitedly about school, about our dog, about silly things. But now, she barely spoke. When I asked if everything was okay, she paused too long before saying yeah. I asked if she knew why I was sent away. Another long pause, then she changed the subject. After we hung up, I checked my mom's Facebook. There was a post from a few days ago, a picture of her, my dad and Lily at a restaurant. The caption read, "Thankful for the people who help protect our family." Protect from what? I scrolled further. Nothing about me, no mention of a son, no sign that I had ever been a part of that life. I needed answers. I messaged my old neighbor, hoping they knew something. It took hours for them to respond. When they did, it was short. "I thought you knew I'm sorry, but I can't say anything." That was when I remembered something small, buried under years of childhood memories, a moment from when I was younger. I had woken up late one night to the sound of my parents arguing in the living room. "We have to keep them apart," my mom had said. "It's not safe," my dad replied. I hadn't understood what they meant at the time, but now I had to wonder, were they trying to protect me, or protect someone from me? That night, I had a dream. I was younger, standing in the middle of the living room. My mom was crying, my dad looking pale and frozen, and I was screaming. Not words, just raw, animal-like sounds. I woke up sweating, heart pounding. The next morning, I told my aunt and uncle I wasn't leaving their house until they told me the truth. They finally admitted my parents had sent me away because of something I did, but they wouldn't tell me what. If they wouldn't, I'd find out myself. Days after confronting my aunt and uncle, I got a text from Lily. "I found something. Call me when you can." She never sent messages like that. No emojis, no casual hi or miss you, just that. I called immediately. She picked up but didn't say anything at first. I could hear her breathing. Then finally, she spoke. She had been cleaning out the attic with my dad. They were going through old boxes when she found one that was locked. She asked about it, but my dad brushed it off, said it was just old junk. Later, when no one was around, she went back and pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside was a notebook. Our mom's. Lily flipped through it, expecting random thoughts, grocery lists, maybe some letters. But then, she saw my name. Over and over. She started reading. The first few pages were normal. Notes about her day, things Lily and I did as kids. But then, the entries changed. One, dated when I was around 5 years old, was different from the rest. "Something isn't right. He's not like other kids. Sometimes when he looks at me, it feels like he's someone else entirely." Lily's voice wavered as she told me this. I asked her to read more. She hesitated but kept going. "Last night, I woke up to him standing in our room. He wasn't moving, just staring. I called his name, but he didn't answer. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away." There were more entries like that. Incidents where my mom wrote about feeling uneasy. Times she thought I had done something but couldn't prove it. And then, an entry about Lily. "I can't pretend anymore. Something happened today. Something bad. I don't know if I can keep him here." Lily stopped reading after that. She didn't tell me what the entry said about her. I asked, but she kept repeating. "I don't remember. I don't think I want to." But I knew she was lying. The next morning, I started looking up names. In one of the last entries, my mom mentioned taking me to a therapist when I was 5. I had no memory of that. If I had seen someone, why didn't I remember? I checked online and found an old listing. The office had shut down years ago, but there was a contact number. I called. A woman answered. I said my name, and there was a pause. Then, in a careful but professional tone, she said, "I'm sorry, but I can't discuss past patients. If you're struggling with something, I strongly recommend you seek professional guidance." Then she hung up. I tried calling back, but she never picked up again. That night, Lily messaged me again. "Drop this, please. I have a bad feeling." I wanted to ask what she meant, but before I could type a response, another text popped up. Not from Lily, not from anyone I recognized. An unknown number. "You need to stop asking questions. Some things are better left in the past." I stared at the message for a long time. Someone was watching. Someone didn't want me to remember. But I wasn't going to stop now. The messages didn't stop. The first one had been unsettling enough, but within hours, I got 2 more from the same unknown number. "This isn't safe for you." Then, minutes later, "Your parents did the right thing." I stared at my phone. The only people who knew what I was digging into were Lily and my aunt and uncle. So who else was watching me? The next morning, my phone rang again. This time, it was the old therapist. She barely spoke above a whisper. Her voice was shaky, words rushed. She didn't answer any of my questions, just kept saying I needed to ask my parents directly. Then, before hanging up, she left me with one last thing. "Some things are better left alone." I called my mom immediately. The second she picked up, I started pressing her. The package, the missing pictures, the journal, the therapist. I asked why I had been sent away, why she never answered my letters, why she acted like I didn't exist. She tried to change the subject. told me she was busy, asked about my school, acted like nothing was wrong. I pushed harder. Then she snapped. Her voice dropped, sharp and final. Let the past stay buried. She hung up. A few hours later, Lily called. She was breathing fast, her voice frantic. She had remembered something. Not everything, just flashes. A night when she was little, waking up to the sound of crying. She had crept out of bed, walked down the hall, and found our parents huddled in the living room. They were holding me, not hugging, holding, like they were afraid to let go. That was the final straw. I needed to go back. I got in my car and drove to my childhood home. My parents still lived there. I didn't stop, just drove past slowly, scanning the yard, the driveway, the windows. Then I saw it, the shed in the backyard. It wasn't big, just an old wooden structure with a rusted lock on the door. I didn't remember ever playing in it as a kid. In fact, I didn't remember it at all. But the second I saw it, something twisted in my stomach. That night, I came back. I parked down the street, walked through the side yard, and reached the shed. The lock was old, corroded. I wedged a crowbar into the latch and pried. It snapped open with a metallic crack. Inside, the air was stale, dust floated in thin streaks of moonlight. The floor was cluttered with forgotten junk, boxes, broken furniture, a rusted bike, and in the farthest corner, half hidden behind a stack of crates, I saw it. A small mattress. The fabric was stained, the edges frayed. Scattered around it were old toys, a stuffed bear, a few plastic figurines. I stepped closer. The dust was thick, undisturbed. No one had touched this place in years. I sent Lily a picture. She responded almost instantly. Oh my God, I remember. Another message came through. You used to sleep there. Then it hit me. Nights spent alone in the dark. The rough fabric of a blanket. My mom whispering, just one more night, sweetheart. The sound of a lock clicking shut from the outside. I stumbled back, heart hammering. What kind of parents made their child sleep in a shed? And what had I done to make them so afraid of me? I ran out, barely remembering to relock the door. My hands were shaking as I got into my car and turned the key. Before I could pull away, my phone buzzed. It was my dad. His voice was heavy, tired, like he already knew what I had found. It's time we talk. I agreed to meet him the next day. I was finally going to hear the truth. I met my parents at a diner just outside of town. It was the kind of place where the waitresses knew the regulars, where the coffee was always refilled before you could ask. My parents were already there when I walked in. My mom looked like she hadn't slept in days. My dad sat stiff, staring at the table. Neither of them spoke when I sat down. The waitress came by, but no one ordered. The silence stretched. My mom gripped her coffee cup, fingers trembling. Then, in a barely there whisper, she said the first words. We thought we were doing the right thing. My mother whispered. We wanted to protect you, but we also wanted to believe that maybe, with enough distance, things would get better on their own. I waited. She didn't look at me when she started talking. She spoke like she was confessing to something, like she had been waiting years to say it, but never wanted to. When I was 5, something happened. Something no one ever talked about. A neighbor's son got hurt, badly. I had been playing with him in the backyard. My parents had stepped inside for just a minute. When they came back, he was on the ground, bleeding, and I was standing over him. They rushed him to the hospital. His parents were furious, but after a long conversation with mine, they agreed not to press charges. Maybe because they believed it was an accident. Maybe because they wanted to get as far away from us as possible. That wasn't the first time. There were other incidents. Small things at first. Scratches, bruises, unexplained outbursts. Things that could be blamed on a rough-playing kid. But it got worse. One time, my dad found our cat locked in the basement, terrified. No one knew how it got there. Another time, my mom woke up to find me in the kitchen, holding a knife. I wasn't using it, just holding it. The worst part, I had no memory of any of it. That's when they started locking me in the shed at night. It wasn't punishment, my mom said. It was the only way they could sleep without wondering if they'd wake up to something worse. She broke down, her hands shaking. We thought it would stop, but it didn't. They took me to a specialist, a child therapist. They were told I might have an impulse control disorder, something that made me act before thinking. The doctor said it could be dangerous. They tried everything, therapy, routine changes, keeping a closer eye on me. But then, one night, Lily woke up screaming. She was 6. I was 8. My parents ran into her room and found me standing over her bed, not speaking, not moving, just staring. Lily was shaking, too scared to even cry. That was it. That was the moment they made the decision. They sent me away, hoping distance would fix me, but it was never supposed to be permanent. My dad finally spoke then. His voice was flat, exhausted. Every time they thought about bringing me back, fear held them back. The therapy reports, the memories, the nights spent wondering if it would happen again. They had decided whether I got better or not. I was never coming home. And the hardest part, they had never planned to tell me. They hoped I'd just move on, never knowing the truth. My mom finally looked at me. Do you remember any of it? I didn't answer, because the truth was, I didn't. But as I walked out of that diner, one thought kept creeping into my mind. If I had done it before, could I do it again? For days after meeting my parents, everything felt different. Every movement, every habit, every moment I had ever spent alone. I couldn't stop replaying their words. We did it to protect you. You hurt someone. You don't remember. I tried to brush it off, tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but there was something, an itch in the back of my mind, like a missing piece of a puzzle I had never noticed before, a memory just out of reach. Then, Lily called me again. Her voice was hesitant, careful, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I've been remembering things, she admitted, but I don't know if they're real, or just how I pieced things together over the years. She didn't explain further, and I didn't ask, because deep down, I already knew. The next day, I went to my aunt and uncle. I asked them what I had been like as a kid. Before I was sent away, my aunt tried to dodge the question at first, brushing it off like it wasn't a big deal. But when I pressed her, really pressed her, she finally exhaled and said something that made my stomach drop. There were times we were scared of you too. That night, I had a dream. No, not a dream. A memory. I was young, maybe 5 or 6. I was holding something heavy. My fingers were wrapped around it so tightly. My knuckles turned white. Someone was in front of me. A small figure. A boy. I swung. There was a scream. Then silence. I woke up gasping, my heart slamming against my ribs. My hands were clenched into fists. I looked down at them, expecting them to be covered in red. They weren't, but I could still feel it. The weight of the object in my hands, the moment of impact, the stillness afterward. I needed proof. The next morning I started digging through records. Hospital records, old news articles, anything that could tell me what really happened to the neighbor's kid. I found it, a hospital intake form. From nearly 15 years ago, the boy had been admitted with a head injury, blunt force trauma. The cause was listed as an accident. But then I found something else. His family moved away just weeks later. No warnings, no goodbyes, just gone. It wasn't a coincidence. They had been afraid of me. That night, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. It wasn't a slow memory. It wasn't something I had to dig for. It hit me all at once, like a punch to the chest. I saw myself, younger, gripping a broken toy. The other boy on the ground, unmoving. I had done it, and I hadn't felt anything. Lily texted me one last time. I'm scared of what we'll find out. For the first time, she wasn't shutting me out. She was letting me in. But I had already made up my mind. I wasn't fixed. I had just been waiting. And the worst part, I had no idea if or when it would happen again. After I found out what I had done, I cut off everyone. No calls, no messages. I ignored texts from Lily, my aunt, even my parents. I didn't know what to say to them. What was there to say? They had been right to be afraid of me. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw something different, not just my face, something underneath. I told myself it was in the past, that I was just a kid when it happened, that I had changed. But every time I let my mind wander, I came back to the same thought. What if I hadn't? A few days later, my phone rang again, unknown number. I almost ignored it, almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. A man's voice came through the line. Steady, measured, he was the father of the boy I had hurt. I froze. He had been waiting years to talk to me. He wanted to meet. For a second I considered hanging up, pretending I never got the call. But I didn't. Instead I agreed. We met at a coffee shop the next morning. I spotted him the second I walked in. He was older than I remembered, his hair graying at the edges. His face had deep lines, the kind that came from years of worry. He didn't look angry, just tired. I sat down. At first we just stared at each other. Then, he told me about his son. He survived the incident, but he was never the same. He had struggled with anxiety, fear, nightmares that never really went away. I braced myself for the worst. For him to tell me I had ruined his son's life, that he had spent years hating me, wanting revenge. But he didn't. Instead, he looked me straight in the eye and said something I wasn't expecting. I don't think you're a monster. I didn't know how to respond. He said he didn't believe I had meant to hurt his son, that I was just a child who needed help, that my parents had made the only choice they thought they could. But then he asked me something that made my chest tighten. Have you ever felt it since then? The urge. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him it had never happened again, that I had never felt anything close to what happened that day. But the truth was, I didn't know. I shook my head anyway, lied. Before he left, he gave me one last warning. If you ever feel it again, promise me you'll get help. I nodded, but his words stuck with me. Because no matter how much I tried to ignore it, one thought kept creeping into my mind. What if I hadn't changed? What if I was just waiting? And what if, the next time it happened, I didn't stop myself? I tried to go back to my normal life, wake up, go to class, eat, sleep, repeat. But nothing felt normal anymore. Lily kept checking in, texts every day, calls every few nights. I told her I was fine. She didn't believe me. Neither did I. Then, one night, everything shifted. I was walking home from a late-night store run. The streets were mostly empty. Streetlights buzzed. In the distance, I heard the faint hum of traffic. Then a noise cut through the quiet. An argument. It was coming from an alley just ahead. A man's voice, low and angry. A woman's voice, shaky and defensive. I slowed down. Then I saw it. The man had the woman backed against the wall. His hand wrapped around her wrist. She tried to pull away, but he held firm. I stepped forward without thinking. My heart pounded. My hands clenched into fists. My breath slowed. The world shrank down to just the three of us. A familiar feeling crept in. Calm. Too calm. I had felt it before. Not fear. Not anger. Just cold, detached focus. My mind raced through 100 possibilities. 100 ways to end this. It would be easy. One quick move. A hit to the throat. A strike to the knee. A shove to the ground. I could stop him. I could hurt him. And I wanted to. I took another step forward, then stopped. I pulled out my phone and called the police instead. The man noticed me then. His grip loosened. He cursed under his breath and let the woman go. She ran. He ran. I followed just long enough to see the cops pull up. They tackled him before he could get far. I stood there watching, my hands still shaking, not from fear, from something else. I wanted him to fight back. I wanted him to give me a reason. I wanted an excuse. What did that make me? I went home and called Lily. I told her everything. She listened in silence. Then, finally she spoke. You need to talk to someone. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't panicking. Just stating a fact. Not to fix you, she said, but to understand yourself. I didn't answer right away, because she was right. If I ignored this, it wouldn't go away. The next morning, I made an appointment with a psychologist. The first time I had ever willingly sought help. And as I hung up, I realized something. Maybe my parents weren't afraid of me. Maybe they were afraid of what I could become. The office was small, quiet. A couch, a chair, a desk, neutral colors, calming tones. The therapist sat across from me, waiting. I told her everything. The shed, the memories, the missing pieces, the neighbor's son, the moment I almost lost control in the alley. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat back, thoughtful. Then she asked the question that made my stomach tighten. What do you think you're capable of? I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't know. She didn't push. She let the silence sit between us. Then she told me something that shifted everything I thought I knew. She didn't think I was broken. She didn't think I was dangerous, but she did think I had intermittent explosive disorder. A condition where sudden uncontrollable bursts of anger override logic, where emotions build and build, until they snap. Some people lash out, some throw things, some get into fights, and some don't remember it happening at all. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a free pass. It was a battle, a lifelong one. It could be managed, controlled, but it wouldn't just go away. I asked the question that had been haunting me since I started this journey. Does this mean I'm doomed to be dangerous? She didn't hesitate. Your actions define you, not your impulses. You've already proven you can control them. I let that sink in. A week later, I got a letter from my mom, handwritten, pages worn at the edges, like she had read it over too many times before sending it. She apologized. She admitted they had been scared, that they had handled things the wrong way, but they had never stopped loving me. They had never stopped caring. Lily called that night. She told me something she had never admitted before. When I was sent away, she used to have nightmares about me, about waking up to find me standing over her bed again, but not anymore. I don't think you're dangerous, she said. I think you're stronger than you realize. I started therapy after that, not to fix myself, but to understand myself, to stop running from the truth. The fear didn't disappear overnight. It probably never would, but it wasn't fear of what I could do. It was fear of what would happen if I stopped trying to control it. And one last question kept circling in my mind. If I had never found out the truth, would I still have become the same person? I don't know, but I do know one thing. I'm not that kid anymore. Maybe my parents sent me away to protect me from myself, but now it's up to me to decide who I want to be.